On the night the Vale Dam broke, Elias Mercer had one choice: save the first crop he had ever owned, or cut the bank himself and send the flood straight through it. He raised the axe over his own headgate. Across the black water, 5 men were trapped in a bunkhouse, and 30 breeding mares were screaming behind a locked corral. The rancher who owned them had spent the spring trying to drive Elias out of the valley. Elias swung anyway. 4 months earlier, nobody in Harney County would have believed it. Oregon, 1891. The old Sutter place had been empty for 5 years. Before that, it had been 310 acres of bunchgrass, barley ground, and hard hope along the south edge of Harney Valley. Then came 2 dry summers, a grasshopper year, and a winter cold enough to split cottonwood trunks. By the time Amos Sutter left, the well had gone bitter, the shearing shed had folded inward, and the irrigation ditch had filled with rabbit brush. The bank took the property. Then the bank tried to sell it. 3 men rode out to look. The first never opened the gate. The second walked as far as the dry headgate, kicked the warped boards, and laughed. The third asked whether the deed could be rewritten to exclude the east pasture. It could not. Elias Mercer bought all of it. He was 35 years old. He had spent 13 years moving from cattle outfits in Nevada to sheep camps in Idaho and hay crews across eastern Oregon. He slept in bunkhouses, carried his own coffee, mended his own boots, and treated every unnecessary dollar as a piece of land he had not bought yet. When the bank clerk counted his money, there were $610 on the desk, every dollar Elias had. The clerk pushed the deed across. Elias signed it with a hand that had been split open by rope frost, alkali, and work. That afternoon he rode through the broken gate of the Sutter place with $11 in his pocket, a bedroll behind his saddle, and ownership of more trouble than most men would accept for free. He stood beside the old headgate. The ditch beyond it was dry. The north field was gray with weeds. The windmill had lost 2 blades and leaned east as if it had grown tired of resisting the weather. Elias looked at the land until the defects stopped appearing one by one and became a sequence. Clear the ditch, find the grade, repair the windmill, test the spring, fence the south pasture last. He knelt and pressed his fingers into the dust at the bottom of the ditch. Beneath the dry crust, the soil was cool. That was why he had bought the place. Not because it was cheap, because the ditch was dry, but not dead. He had just set his survey stakes when he heard a horse at the gate. The woman who rode in did not belong to the struggling end of the valley. Her bay mare was fine-boned and perfectly kept. Her riding skirt was practical but expensive. She sat the saddle with the unconscious balance of someone who had learned horses before she learned manners. She stopped beside the ruined windmill. "Mr. Mercer?" Elias straightened. He had told no one where he would be that afternoon. That depends who is asking. Clara Vale. The name explained the horse. Her father, Gideon Vale, owned nearly 8,000 acres north of the Sutter line, including the Upper Creek, the old diversion dam, and enough cattle to make the county assessor speak politely. Clara looked past Elias toward the east pasture. "My father sent me with an offer." She removed an envelope from the inside pocket of her coat. $1,050, cash draft. "You sign the deed back to the bank's attorney, and you can leave with more money than you arrived with." Elias looked at the envelope, then at the dry ditch. "Why does your father want land nobody else would take?" Her eyes sharpened slightly. "He wants a clean southern boundary. That is not an answer. It is the answer he gave me." Elias picked up a stake and drove it into the ditch bank. Clara waited. He drove another. The sound carried across the empty field. Finally, she said, "You have owned this place for less than 1 day. 13 years." Her expression changed. 13? "That draft can buy dirt," Elias said. "It cannot buy the mornings I traded for it." He pulled the next stake from his belt. "Tell your father the boundary is going to stay untidy." Clara did not seem offended. If anything, she seemed relieved to have received a real answer. She put the envelope away. "You know the spring that fed this ditch has been unreliable since the winter of '87. I know. The lower soil is alkali. I know. The old diversion agreement is disputed. I know that too." She looked at the warped headgate, the leaning windmill, the roofless shed, and the man who had just spent everything he owned to inherit all of it. "You may be the most informed fool in Harney County." Elias set another stake. "I have worked for men with larger titles." For the first time, she almost smiled. Then she turned her mare and rode north. Elias watched her pass through the broken gate. He knew 2 things before she disappeared beyond the sage. Gideon Vale wanted more than a clean boundary. and Clara Vale would come back. She returned 4 days later without the envelope. Elias was standing in the ditch with an A-frame level he had built from scrap lumber and a plumb line weighted by a horseshoe nail. Clara dismounted and watched him mark the bank. "You are dropping too fast," she said. Elias did not look up. "I have half an inch over 10 feet. You have half an inch where you are standing. The ground rises under the greasewood 50 yards ahead." He checked the frame again. "It does not." "It does." He turned. She had tied her mare to the windmill and was already walking toward him. "My father had this ditch surveyed when I was 12. Water crossed the first 100 yards, slowed under the greasewood, and cut back toward the road. Sutter lost half his spring flow there every May." Elias looked at his stakes, then at the shallow rise he had not yet reached. "You remember a ditch survey from 12 years ago? I remember anyone being wrong in public." She took the A-frame from him, set it across the soil, and adjusted one leg. "The valley floor lies to the eye," she said. "Water does not care what looks level, it follows the grade." She moved 3 stakes, only 3, but the corrected line changed the entire run of the ditch. Elias tested it twice. She was right. He handed her the plumb line. "Show me the next 100 yards. Clara looked at him, surprised by how little argument he had offered. "Just like that? I paid $610 for land. I did not pay for the privilege of being wrong on it." That time she did smile. They worked until sunset. The next week she came twice, the week after that 3 times. Not on a schedule either of them admitted to recognizing. She brought an old county survey copy, a hand auger, and knowledge no deed could contain. She knew where the spring water surfaced after a wet winter. She knew which low field held frost 2 weeks longer than the rest. She knew the gray crust near the south fence was not dead soil but salt drawn upward by shallow water. Elias knew labor. Clara knew the valley. Together they made the old Sutter place begin to answer questions. At first they spoke only about work, how deep to cut, where to brace the headgate, how to rebuild the windmill tail so it would turn before the gusts became violent. Then the work made room for other things. Elias told her about the ranches he had crossed, the Nevada outfit where the foreman docked a man's pay for a broken cinch, the Idaho winter where 7 herders shared one stove and slept in shifts closest to it, the hay crew outside Burns that paid $2 more a month if a man could sharpen his own blades. Clara told him about Portland, the women's academy her father had chosen, the piano lessons she hated, the arithmetic teacher she loved, the letters from home that described cattle prices but never described loneliness. One evening, they sat on the bank above the repaired ditch. A thin line of water moved through it for the first time, not enough to irrigate a field, enough to prove the spring still had a voice. Clara watched it slip around a stone. "Why this place?" she asked. Elias rested his arms on his knees. "Because everybody had already decided what it was worth. That usually lowers the price. It also lowers the number of people telling you what it must become." She looked toward the ruined shed. "You wanted land no one else believed in. I wanted one thing in my life that could not be taken from me at the end of a season." The water reached the first turn. It did exactly what her corrected stakes had predicted. Clara said, "My father owns more ground than he can see from any one ridge." Elias waited. "He thinks ownership and care are the same thing. They can be. They are not always." "No," she glanced at him. "You disagree very carefully. I have met your father once at a distance. I would like the distance to remain healthy." She laughed, and the sound startled a meadowlark out of the greasewood. Neither of them saw the rider on the northern rise. Vale's foreman sat there long enough to understand the scene. Then he turned his horse toward home. Gideon Vale arrived the following morning. He was 62, iron-backed, broad through the chest, and dressed like a man who did not waste money but had enough of it to make that choice look severe. He dismounted beside the headgate. His eyes moved over the rebuilt timbers, the corrected grade, and the water now traveling farther than it had in years. "You found the rise under the greasewood," he said. "Your daughter found it." Gideon's jaw tightened. "She had no business here. She had more business here than I did." She knew the ground. "My daughter was educated in Portland, so I have heard. She can keep accounts, speak French, and play Chopin." Elias looked toward the ditch. "She can also read falling water across alkali soil. That is not the life I prepared her for." Elias met his eyes. "What life did you prepare her for?" Gideon stepped closer. "One that does not begin with a collapsed shed and $11. There was no insult in his tone. That made it cut cleaner. He looked across Elias's 310 acres. This place will take years before it gives you anything back. Maybe it never will. Clara has already spent enough of her life watching men build. I have asked her for nothing. You do not need to ask. I know my daughter. So do I a little. The silence between them hardened. Gideon said, then know this. She will not spend her future waiting for a ditch to fill. Elias looked at the moving water. With respect, Mr. Vale, that is not your ditch to close. Gideon's face did not change, but something behind it did. He put on his gloves. The offer remains. The answer does too. Gideon mounted. Before leaving, he looked once more at the water passing cleanly through the corrected turn. Then he rode north without another word. Clara came that evening. She had already spoken to her father. He told me I was finished coming here. Elias kept fitting boards to the windmill tail. What did you tell him? That he confused issuing an order with changing a fact. Elias stopped working. You said that to Gideon Vale? I used more words. I imagine he enjoyed each one. He did not. She picked up a brace. Where does this go? For the rest of spring they worked openly. Gideon did not approve. Clara did not ask again. Elias cleared the north field and planted 22 acres of barley. He bought 6 thin heifers from a failed outfit near Druzy. Animals nobody wanted because they looked more bone than beef. He fenced the south pasture. He set every brace post toward the pull. He rebuilt the windmill with a salvaged wheel and new bolts he could barely afford. By June, water reached the barley twice a week. Not much. Enough. The field turned from gray to a green so bright it looked almost defiant. Clara stood at its edge one Thursday evening. You did it. We did part of it. That sounds dangerously close to gratitude. I am trying to improve. She looked toward the north ridge where her father's land began. My father thinks hardship is a disease he can keep from me. Elias set down the shovel. He has known enough of it to fear it. He started with a mule, 1 blanket and $42. Elias raised an eyebrow. You know that? Everyone knows that. No, everyone knows he started poor. You know the number, he told me once. Before the ranch became too large for old stories, she ran her hand across a barley head. I think he is afraid I will admire in you what he had to kill in himself to become Gideon Vale. Elias considered that. Then do not admire it. She looked at him. Build your own reasons. By July the barley stood waist high. The 6 heifers had gained weight. The spring flow weakened but held. Elias had begun to believe the land might carry him through winter. Then on the hottest afternoon of the month, clouds built over Steen's Mountain. They rose black and sudden, their undersides green with hail. Old men in town would later say the storm broke in the wrong place. Too much rain fell too high, too quickly, over ground baked hard enough to shed water like iron. At dusk, Clara was at her father's ranch checking foaling records. Elias was at his headgate, clearing tumbleweed from the screen. The first sign was not thunder. It was a sound beneath it, a deep, continuous roar coming from the north. Elias climbed the ditch bank. A rider appeared on the ridge, waving both arms. Behind him, where Vale's upper diversion dam should have held the runoff, a brown wall moved through the cottonwoods. The dam had failed. The water was coming down the old creek channel directly toward Vale's lower compound. The bunkhouse stood in the channel's bend, so did the mare corral. Elias knew the ground between. He knew because Clara had made him learn every rise and hollow around the spring. He also knew the only place the flood could be turned, his own headgate. If he cut through the south bank and opened the old Sutter overflow channel, the water would leave Vale's lower yard and spread across Elias's north field. The field where 22 acres of barley were 3 weeks from harvest. The field that represented his winter feed, his seed money, and nearly every chance he had of keeping the property. For 1 second he stood absolutely still. Then he ran for his horse. He reached the Vale compound ahead of the main surge. Men were shouting. The lower yard had already filled ankle deep. 5 ranch hands were inside the bunkhouse, trying to drag trunks and bedding to the upper floor. The mare corral held 30 breeding animals, several with young foals at their sides. Gideon was on the porch, ordering men toward the road. Clara was fighting the corral latch, which had twisted under pressure. Elias rode straight to her. The upper dam is gone. I know. The creek bend will take the bunkhouse first. The men will not leave the records and rifles. They will when the wall hits. She looked north. The roar had grown louder. Elias pointed south. I can turn it through the Sutter overflow. Clara understood before he finished. Your barley. Yes. Elias. That field is everything. No. He looked at the bunkhouse. That is 5 men, then at the mares. That is 30 animals and half your father's breeding line. Gideon reached them. What are you saying? Elias did not soften it. I cut my bank. The flood crosses my field instead of your lower yard. How long? Minutes. Gideon looked toward the black line of water moving through the cottonwoods. What happens to your crop? It goes. What happens to your ditch? It goes too. For once, Gideon Vale had no instruction ready. Elias turned his horse. Clara caught the bridle. I am coming. No, you need someone at the lower gate. The lower gate may be underwater. That is why you need someone who knows where it is. He looked at her. The storm flashed white across the valley. Stay on the high bank, he said. That is not agreement. It is the only order you are getting. They rode. The rain hit halfway to the Sutter line, not drops. Sheets. The overflow channel was an old scar through the sage, nearly erased by 5 dry years. Elias found it by the cottonwood stump Clara had shown him in April. They reached the headgate as the first surge struck the north side. The timbers shuddered. Water climbed the boards in seconds. Elias pulled the axe from his saddle. Clara rode down the bank toward the lower release. Elias, he turned. She was pointing upstream. A second surge, larger than the first, carried fence rails, brush, and part of the broken diversion structure. It would hit before the headgate could be dismantled. The bank had to be breached now. Elias climbed onto the sod wall and swung. The first strike split the brace. The second drove through. The third jarred the axe out of his hands as debris slammed the gate. Water knocked him to one knee. Clara screamed his name. He found the handle under the current, stood and struck again. The brace broke. The headgate twisted sideways. A black sheet of water punched through the opening and tore into the north field. Barley folded in a single moving line. Thousands of green heads vanished beneath mud, timber, and foam. The force widened the breach. Elias jumped clear as half the bank collapsed. Then Clara's horse went down. The lower gate had opened, but the return current caught the mare broadside. Clara hit the water and disappeared. Elias ran into the channel. The water reached his waist, then his chest. He saw her hand once between 2 pieces of brush. He lunged, caught her coat, and lost his footing. For several seconds, neither of them was standing. The current drove them against a fence brace. Elias hooked one arm through the wire, pulled Clara above water, and held until her boots found the bank. Together, coughing and bleeding, they crawled onto high ground. Below them, the north field was gone. But the flood had turned. The main current poured through the Sutter overflow, spread across the barley, and lost its height. At the Vale lower yard, the water rose to the bunkhouse steps and stopped. The 5 men came out. The corral held. All 30 mares remained above the current. Gideon stood in the rain and watched the water carrying Elias Mercer's first harvest away. No one spoke. There was too much sound for words to matter. By morning the valley was quiet. The north field lay under 6 inches of mud. The ditch had been cut open for nearly 40 yards. The headgate was gone. 2 of Elias's heifers had broken through the south fence during the storm and disappeared into the sage. His haystack had floated against a cottonwood. He walked the field alone. Every barley stalk had been flattened or buried. The arithmetic was simple. No crop, no feed. No money for winter seed. No money to repair the ditch before the spring weakened further. He had saved Vale's bunkhouse and breeding stock. He had also destroyed the only proof his own place had begun to work. Clara found him sitting beside the broken headgate. Her left arm was bandaged. There was a cut across her temple. I am sorry, she said. He looked at the mud. For what? For being right about the channel? He almost laughed, but did not have enough breath in him. The channel did what it was supposed to do. So did you. That is not going to feed 6 heifers. 4 unless the other 2 come home. He looked at her. She had chosen the ugliest fact because she knew kindness would insult him. Your father will send help, she said. I know you sound angry about it. I am deciding how proud I can afford to be. Clara sat beside him. The broken gate creaked in the shallow current. My father once told me water follows the grade, not the man holding the shovel. Elias stared at the wrecked field. He was right. He often is. It is one of his more difficult qualities. Elias looked at his bandaged hands. Accepting help feels like signing away part of the deed. No, Clara said. Letting someone stand beside you is not the same as letting them own the ground. He did not answer. She stayed until sunset. The next morning, 4 Vale wagons came through Elias's gate. They carried squared timber, seed barley, fencing wire, and enough hay to keep 6 heifers through the first snow. 12 ranch hands followed. The foreman climbed down. Mr. Vale says the flood charged his ranch and the bill belongs to him. Elias looked at the wagons. I did not send a bill. He knows. That timber is too much. The foreman shrugged. He said you would say that. What did he tell you to say after? That the interest will be unbearable if you keep arguing. Elias looked toward the north field. 12 men waited without impatience. For 13 years, he had measured himself by how little he needed. Standing there, he understood the weakness hidden inside that pride. A man could become so committed to carrying his own weight that he refused to notice when the load had stopped being his alone. He stepped aside. Start with the headgate. The foreman nodded. No speech, no victory, just men unloading timber. Gideon came 3 days later. He walked the damaged field with Elias. The new headgate frame stood unfinished beside the breach. Mud had dried in hard plates across the barley. At the edge of the overflow channel, Gideon stopped. You knew cutting the bank would ruin this field, yes. You did not know whether the turn would hold. I knew the grade. Gideon looked at him. Clara taught you. She taught me where the ground stopped lying. That almost produced a smile. Almost. Gideon crouched and picked up a barley stalk from the mud. I built my first ditch with a shovel I stole. Elias said nothing. Borrowed, Gideon corrected. From a man who would not have lent it. He rolled the broken stalk between his fingers. I had $42, a mule with one good eye, and the belief that hunger was temporary if I worked faster than it moved. Clara told me. She remembers too much. She says the same of you. Gideon looked across the ruined field. I spent 30 years making certain she would never have to begin where I did. That is not a small thing. No, but I mistook protection for authority. He dropped the stalk. You cut your own bank before you asked whether the men in my bunkhouse deserved saving. They were in the water. You turned the flood through the first crop you had ever owned. It was the only turn. No, Gideon said. It was the only decent turn. Men avoid those every day. He faced Elias fully. I am not giving you my approval like a permit. I did not ask for one. I know. The words carried more respect than offense. As Gideon pointed toward the new timber, you will repay the materials when the place can carry it. Yes, the labor is mine. I can repay labor. You can try. I will refuse. Elias considered the terms, then nodded once. Gideon looked toward the south pasture. Your 2 missing heifers are in my west meadow, Elias exhaled. They crossed during the flood. They have poor judgment. They are young. So is my daughter. Elias waited. Gideon put on his hat. She is not. It was the closest he came to apology that day. Before leaving, he said, the spring agreement was never unclear. I made it sound unclear because I wanted the east strip. Elias's eyes hardened. Gideon continued before he could speak. The original Sutter deed carries 1/3 of the diversion flow after stock water. I found the county copy yesterday. You had not found it before? I had not looked where I knew it would be. The honesty was ugly. That made it valuable. I will record the agreement this week. Elias looked at the destroyed field, the new timber, and the man who had tried to buy him out because control was easier than uncertainty. Why tell me? Because I am trying to improve. Elias heard Clara in the words. This time, he did smile. The field could not be saved that summer, but the new barley sprouted in the wet silt quickly enough to hold the soil. The repaired ditch carried water again by August. Vale's hay kept the heifers alive. Elias repaid the timber over 2 years. The labor was never mentioned. In September, Clara stood with him beside the new headgate. The water moved cleanly through the gate, down the corrected grade, and around the bend beneath the greasewood. I have been waiting for you to ask me something, she said. Elias leaned on the shovel. I have asked you many things. You have asked me where to place stakes, when to open the gate, whether the east field holds frost, and why my father speaks as if every sentence belongs in a courthouse. Important matters. You have not asked the important one. He looked at her. Clara was not smiling. That made him nervous. I have $11 less than when we met, he said. You had $11 when we met. Then my situation is stable, Elias. He set the shovel down. I have a broken field, 6 heifers, a rebuilt headgate, and a debt to your father. You also have 310 acres that survived a flood because you understood them. Clara, I am not asking whether you can give me an easy life. The water clicked against the new boards. I am asking whether you want to build the hard one with me. Elias looked at the woman who had arrived carrying money to remove him, then stayed to redraw the grade beneath his feet. Yes, he said. She stepped closer. You were supposed to ask, will you marry me? Yes, you answered very fast. I have been ready since you admitted the valley floor lied. They married beneath the cottonwoods beside the restored diversion ditch. No church, no polished carriage. No crowd large enough to turn the day into performance. Clara wore a cream-colored dress her mother had owned and boots she refused to hide beneath it. Elias wore a black coat borrowed from the Vale foreman. Gideon was not there when the county judge opened his book. Clara did not look toward the road, not at first. Then came the sound of a wagon. Gideon Vale drove through the gate with the original diversion ledger beside him and a walnut survey box on the seat. He stopped at the head gate. Everyone waited. Gideon climbed down and walked to his daughter. "I was delayed at the recorder's office." He handed Elias the filed water agreement. The Sutter share had been entered under the Mercer name. Then he gave Clara the walnut box. Inside was the brass level he had used to survey his first ditch. "You were the first person in this valley to make that instrument more accurate than I was," he said. Clara's eyes filled. Gideon offered her his arm. "I cannot give you an easy life without taking the choice away from you." His voice roughened. "So I will give you this one properly." She took his arm. They walked together to the head gate. Years later, people in Harney County remembered the flood because of the Vale Dam and the field Elias Mercer sacrificed. But that was not what changed the valley. What changed it was everything that came after. 6 heifers became 14, 14 became 31. By the 5th year, the Mercer cattle were known for holding weight through dry summers because Clara managed the water and Elias rotated the grass before the ground was exhausted. The north field never produced the tallest barley in the county. It produced reliably. That mattered more. The old shearing shed became a cattle barn. The windmill stood straight. The ditch carried 1/3 of the diversion flow because the deed said it should, and because Gideon Vale had finally decided a rightful boundary was stronger than a convenient one. He came to supper most Sundays, not all. He remained a man who needed absence to preserve dignity. After supper, he often walked alone to the head gate. He would set the brass level across the timber, check the fall, and test the braces with one hand. One autumn evening, when Elias and Clara had been married 4 years, Gideon stood beside the ditch while their little boy threw cottonwood leaves into the current. Each leaf spun once, found the center, and moved south. Gideon watched them go. "The grade is holding," he said. Clara looked at Elias. Elias looked at the water. "Yes," he said, "it is." That was all Gideon ever said about the marriage. It was enough. Elias Mercer spent 13 years saving $610. He used it to buy land every other man had already judged. A bitter well, a fallen shed, a ditch buried under rabbit brush, a spring people called unreliable because they had stopped listening to the ground around it. Clara Vale rode there with a $1,050 offer meant to make him disappear. Instead, she moved 3 stakes. 3 stakes changed the ditch. The ditch changed the field. The field gave Elias something worth losing, and when the flood came, he opened the bank around that field because 5 men and 30 mares stood below the water. No bargain, no audience, no guarantee the turn would hold. Only the grade beneath him and the knowledge that a decent man does not protect his harvest by letting someone else drown. Gideon Vale had 8,000 acres and enough power to mistake control for wisdom. Elias had 1 axe, 1 field, and a choice. The field was buried. The people lived. Water follows the grade, and in the end so did every man in that valley.